In this episode of True Crime Black, we look at the case of a missing young black woman. Her mother was relentless in searching for her, despite the police not being much help. Her daughter's friends would eventually admit that they were covering for her and that she'd actually gone to see a man the night she went missing. While investigating the disappearance, the young girl's mother would have to endure another family tragedy. Were the cases related? Let's find out. September 26, 2022, marked 6 years since the disappearance of a young black woman. The woman was just 21 years old when she vanished from a home in Richmond, Virginia. On this tragic anniversary, the young woman's mother stood in front of a crowd of people and said something very bold. It turns out that for months, the police have kept the identity of a person of interest a secret. They claim that they were so uncertain of his involvement in the case that they didn't want the public to know who he is. That wasn't enough for this mother. She knew that this man was one of the last to see her alive. She knew that this man had gone to jail for hurting young black women before. She even spoke to the man, and she knew that he was lying about what happened to her daughter that night. Her powerful words were, "He was the last person and knows my daughter's whereabouts and what happened to my daughter," she said. I'm fighting with everything in me, and it is so hard. It's so hard sometimes." But would her actions help to move the case forward? This is the story of Keeshae Jacobs. It all occurred on one autumn night on September 26, 2016. 21-year-old Keeshae Jacobs had made plans to spend the night over at her friend's house in Richmond, Virginia. She left her home at around 11 p.m. that Monday night. Her mother, Toni Jacobs, had given her instructions to send her a text when she arrived at her friend's house so that she knew Keeshae had made it safely. Keeshae did just that, at 11:41 p.m. She concluded her text by telling her mother that she loved her and would see her the following morning. Toni proceeded with the rest of the night having no idea of the importance of that text message. It would be the last time that she ever heard from her daughter. Tragically, Keeshae never returned home the next day, and she hasn't been seen since. Toni, who was very close with her daughter, was expecting to hear from her early the next morning. She immediately knew that something wasn't right when a text or phone call never came. Her older brother, Devin Jacobs, was feeling the same way. The siblings had a very tight bond, and he would have heard from her that day. Devin expected to hear from Keeshae because they had plans to cook breakfast together that Tuesday morning. When he didn't hear a word from his sister, he initially thought that she had a late night and was sleeping in. As the hours passed and she still hadn't shown up, Devin began to worry that something horrible had occurred. Despite being worried, Toni still had to go to work. Her concerns grew more and more as the time passed without Keeshae reaching out to her. Toni says that she and her daughter would text frequently throughout the day, and this absence wasn't like her at all. She called her son and asked if he heard anything from Keeshae, and he expressed the same concerns as his mother. Both of them called Keeshae multiple times in an attempt to get in contact with her. Sadly, her calls went straight to voicemail. Toni returned home from work that afternoon and Keeshae was still not home. She then got on the phone and called all of Keeshae's friends that she was able to get in contact with. She was asking if anyone had heard from her daughter. None of them did, and they couldn't even give Toni an idea of where she could be. As the sun set, Toni was growing more and more concerned. That night, she got into her car and drove around the neighborhood looking for her daughter. Unfortunately, her efforts yielded no results. Toni had to go to bed that night still not knowing where her daughter was. The next morning, she went to the Richmond Police Department and reported Keeshae missing. Toni would be met with a reaction that the families of black missing persons have become all too familiar with. The police initially expressed that Keeshae's case was not much to worry about. They told Toni that her daughter was an adult and could leave her home for an extended period of time if she wanted to. Toni was determined to convince them that this absence was out of the ordinary. Right there in the police station, she pulled out her phone and showed the police her text and call logs. They were able to see just how often she and her daughter communicated and how strange this sudden lapse in communication was. Keeshae was known to be close to her mother. After graduating from Richmond High School, she stayed home so that she could remain close to her family. There were even some nights that she would choose to stay home with her family instead of going out with her friends. The night that she'd gone to her friend's house, she almost chose to stay home. That was because she got into an argument with her boyfriend and was very upset. Her mom and brother would convince her to go out. She was pretty upset, but me and her brother seemed to talk her down, and then she was like, "All right, Ma, I'm going to a friend's house. I'll be back tomorrow," Toni said. So much of this occurrence went against what Toni knew from her daughter in the past. Toni made certain that Keeshae took her phone charger with her before leaving the house. That allowed her to rule out the possibility that her daughter hadn't contacted her because her phone died. Even if it did, Keeshae would usually borrow a friend's phone to text her mother if her phone died in the past. That let Toni know that, wherever Keeshae was, she was unable to gain access to a working phone. Despite all of that, Toni was still hopeful that her daughter was alive somewhere. She said, "She's not gone. I don't feel that she's gone. I just feel that somebody's got her and she can't call me." Then, Toni would receive a major update. After getting home from the police station, Toni was visited by some of Keeshae's friends. Initially, her friends said that they had no idea where she went after leaving her friend's house that morning. It turns out that they were covering for her. They informed Toni that Keeshae had gone to visit a man who was renting a room in a house on Broad Street in the Churchill section of Richmond. Keeshae's friends never explained why they withheld that information from her mother. Nonetheless, they took Toni to the house where she was dropped off. Toni knocked on the door of the home and a man opened the door. When she asked the man if he knew Keeshae, he admitted that he did know her, but hadn't seen her since 5 p.m. on Monday. Toni immediately questioned that since she knew for a fact that Keeshae was home at that time. Toni says that the man then continuously changed his story. Then it went to another time, and I said, "Something isn't right. It's not adding up." It was clear to Toni that the man was lying to her. She called the police and asked them to come to the house. Oddly, the man called a detective in Richmond who was investigating him for another crime. He personally asked that detective to conduct a walkthrough of his home. Toni found this very strange because that detective would not be someone that is on his side, so why would he want him specifically to search the house? In the end though, nothing was found. The police also took measures to keep the man's name out of the public's knowledge. During the following month, Keeshae Jacobs' case would finally see some attention. On October 4, 2016, a press conference was held to update the public about Keeshae's disappearance. The press conference was attended by Toni, who addressed the viewers. "This is the hardest thing I ever had to do in my life. I just want my baby to come home," she said. Toni concluded her speech by asking for anyone who had information to come forward. One day after the press conference, Toni received a phone call. It was from the owner of the house where Keeshae's friends said they dropped her off. It turns out that the man who answered the door was only living there temporarily. Now that he was gone, the caller invited Toni to search the house. Toni didn't find anything belonging to her daughter, but she did notice some bloody tissues in a trash can. Toni then called the police and asked them to search the house. They conducted a thorough search and even collected some evidence. They've yet to give details about what they have specifically. Their search didn't stop there. The investigators also searched the neighborhood surrounding the stranger's home. They paid special attention to nearby Chimborazo Park due to its proximity to the house where Keeshae was last seen. Richmond Police Captain James Lano said, "We searched the park, the areas below the park. We interviewed anybody who had contact with her prior to her going missing and who had potentially seen her within the last 48 to 72 hours. Sadly, their efforts resulted in no information that would give them any clue as to where Keeshae could be. and while searching for Keeshae, Toni would have to endure another tragic event. On January 8, 2017, Devin was shot and killed while outside a motel in Richmond. Toni now had one of her kids missing and the other dead in just a matter of months. A man named James Henshaw was identified as the man who shot Devin. He was found pretty quickly and he admitted that the shooting happened due to an argument. He pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sent away. Devin's shooting was not connected to his sister's disappearance. By the time it had been 6 years since Keeshae went missing, Toni was ready to do something bold. Although the police never released the name of the man who may have been the last person to see her daughter alive, Toni decided that she was ready to reveal his name to the public. At a press conference, she held up a picture of Otis Lee Tucker. As far as Toni is concerned, Otis is the only person who knows exactly what happened to Keeshae. Perhaps his violent past was the reason for that. Otis Tucker had an extensive criminal history. On September 19, 2016, he had attacked another woman in the Broad Street house where he was living. That occurred just 1 week before Keeshae went missing. The woman survived and notified the police. Otis was charged with abduction, rape, and strangulation. The rape charge was later dropped, but in February 2017 he was sentenced to 5 years in prison after pleading guilty to the other charges. Otis was released in 2021 and left Virginia. It wouldn't even be 2 months before he struck again. He was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Ashley Fowler while he was living in Jacksonville, Florida. Detectives, however, have never been able to find any evidence that connected him to Keeshae's disappearance. During a press conference in November 2017, the Richmond Police Department expressed support for solving Keeshae's case. Detective Thompson said, "This is not a young lady that just decided to run away or move to another state. It is not her character to not call her family or friends in 14 months when she would reach out to them every day." Sadly, the police have not been able to make much progress in this case. To this day, Keeshae Jacobs is still considered missing.